did this in a relatively good fashion. So there are several episodes. I excluded, I see, one of the first written theories of nonviolence, principles of nonviolence. That's in the 50th chapter of the book of Genesis in the Torah. And it comes from the life of Joseph, who was one of the people who was kidnapped and went into Egypt, where he became a powerful figure. His brothers sold him as a slave. You may or may not know that story. But when the father, Jacob, died, the brothers were fearful in Egypt that then Joseph would turn against them and get revenge. And they said this to Joseph, and Joseph said that he was not God, that whatever they did was in their hands and they were responsible for it. He was not. That in any case, he was going to treat them as his brothers. They were forgiven, and so forth and so on. That's a wonderful episode in the development of religious attitude. When some of you Christians run around talking about the Old Testament as the Bible is the book of law, and the New Testament is the book of grace, you ought to go to that chapter and look at that story of grace and forgiveness. So that's again presupposition. The undercurrent of nonviolence is in the life and work of Desmond Tutu in the 20th century, as he has written and insisted that there can be no future for the world, no future for the human race without forgiveness. That is an attitude of letting people have second and third and fourth and fifth chance, if necessary, on life. But not an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. Then in the first century, there is both action and theory. In this current era, in the year 26, a man by the name of Pilate became the prefector of the province of Judea, which included Galilee and Samaria in what is Palestine, Israel. He was a Roman political civil servant, you could say. And he marched, he sailed from Rome over to Caesarea, where a city that had been built by King Herod, and then marched from there on a regular basis down into Jerusalem for various major festivals or affairs. Well, when he first reached that part of the world in AD 26, he marched his legions into Jerusalem with their standards that had on them, of course, the Roman emperor, and with the head of the emperor of the Augustus, which he then mounted in the temple area. He did this at night. It may be that he had heard of the rage of the Jew in relationship to the temple and into the relationship to pagan images, which they considered the picture of Caesar on coins or in stone or any kind of plaque, and did not want it in Jerusalem and did not want them anywhere in the temple. And as that word went out, the temple area was filled with hundreds and thousands of Jews, men, mostly, I'm sure, in their traditional dress. And they gathered in the courts demanding that these standards be withdrawn, that it was desecrating the temple. And Pilate could not reason with them. They were angry. They would not leave. And he then finally threatened to turn the troops on them and kill them all. And apparently, we don't know the whole story, but almost as one, the hundreds of people laid down all around the area in the court, and they unwrapped their head wraps and whatnot and bared their necks, and they laid down on the floor and bared their necks to Pilate and said, "We would rather be dead, you kill us." And Pilate backed off in that instance and took the objectionable standards out of the temple, out of Jerusalem, and went and out of the area. That was nonviolent action, though again it was not called that. They did not see themselves necessarily as nonviolent practitioners, but they mobilized their power together. No doubt that required a certain amount of planning and thought ahead of time. No doubt they had to educate themselves while they were all in that area to do what the next step demanded of them. But it is a written illustration of nonviolent action. In Asia, Buddha intervened on a number of occasions. I don't know them all, but a number of occasions, Buddha was a one-man representative of peace who persuaded kings not to go to war against each other. Mosu, a Chinese philosopher in 400 before the current era, on 2 or 3 occasions, the details I have not seen anywhere, but when war was threatening between his country and his king and another king, he went to the other country to engage in dialogue, to insist that there was such thing of universal love and mutual benefit, and that war contradicted that. There again, none of this at that time was called nonviolence, but it does represent a part of this hidden history from ancient times down to the present moment of where people, sometimes spontaneously, not having any other way of action, so it was practical. But on the other side of the coin, in the 20th century, people using Gandhi and King as the illustrations, and the movements in the United States and elsewhere organized quite concretely around what now we can call nonviolence in order to effect change and to effect a difference in themselves. Now, if you have this document, I want Matthew 5, 38, 48. Some of it was passed out last week, but here's some copies for people who don't have it. Because I want to acquaint you with this. This is from the 1st century. It's a very radical statement, an astonishing statement. It's against conventional wisdom. And Christianity does not like it. There are groups of Christians who love it and try to appropriate it and understand it. And historically, some have never allowed any century to pass where they did not keep that light alive. But it's an audacious statement. Christian ethicists have largely sought to repudiate it as having any relevance to practical life. But it is a statement that is one of the most influential statements in the history of nonviolence, both then and now. When Gandhi first read this in around the year 1907 in South Africa, he said, "This is what I was taught as a child, and this is what I've been looking for." And then according to his autobiography and his writings, he proceeded to read this chapter 5 through 7 in the book of Matthew in the New Testament. He proceeded to read it every day as a part of his spiritual undergirding for understanding nonviolence. He said, "This is it." So he was influenced by it. And he did call it nonviolence in all. But just a little bit of the context. I've indicated in that paragraph a little bit of it. You won't find this translation anywhere. It's done by the scholars, the Jesus Seminar people with others who did this translation, because the major Bibles that translate it into English in verse 39, I think it is, "But I tell you, don't resist the evil one," is the way the King James does it, and is the way that I saw it initially. But the language there is not, "do not resist the evildoer." The language there would mean, "do not violently resist the evildoer." In other words, do not imitate the evildoer, is what it means and what it says. As I read this as a youngster, elementary school, learning to read, and as I read it in high school and steadily in college, I recognized it as a fight statement, a statement of resistance and struggle. And so I was really excited in around 1949 when I found Howard Thurman's little book called Jesus and the Disinherited. And Howard Thurman was the first sort of scholar, professor, preacher who wrote about Jesus' gospel as a survival kit for people whose backs are against the wall. That is, for people who are being persecuted and repressed and knocked down. It is a survival kit. And what this particular paragraph points to is something rather simple and yet very difficult and complicated. Jesus is saying to people who are being persecuted, they're living in Galilee, where this probably was said first, that is occupied by Roman legionnaires. It has been a hotbed of freedom. This is where a major group called the Maccabees 200 years ago fought for about 200 years against every invader in order to try to establish the integrity of their homeland and all. So it's a hotbed where people resisted tyranny in many different forms. And what Jesus is saying here is that you cannot really do that much about the legionnaire or those who persecute you or the Jewish elite that collaborates with the Roman Empire and that taxes you so that you lose your land, because we know now that that was a part of the condition of Galilee and Judea in that first century agricultural revolution in which many people who owned land for generations lost it in debt and the rest of it. But Jesus said you can manage your own life in such a way that you do not allow the rage and the anger and the fear and the deception to control your life. This is what Howard Thurman suggests in this little book. So this is a practical story. It is true, the scholars have well established, that the Roman Empire had a law that if a legionnaire, a Roman citizen, were moving from one place to a next place and carried a pack, that he could tell a Greek in Greece or an Egyptian or a Galilean in Galilee, boy, carry my pack. And they were required to carry it for 1 mile or take the consequences for it. So Jesus said, this is the law of the land. What can you do about it? Put up a fight and be crucified, as did happen under Roman rule? Jesus suggests there's a better way. In your own line, claim in your own life, claim your own humanity. And decide that you're not going to allow an aggressor, a persecutor, a Roman soldier, a soldier who's a mercenary from Persia or somewhere else, or Asia. You're not going to allow them to destroy your day while you're walking that pack a mile, you're in rage and silence and on the inside on fire. Develop a sense that you can manage your own life and that you don't have to imitate those who would hate you or persecute you. So the Roman soldier, they go take you, say, carry the bag for 1 mile, talk to the soldier. This is my now describing what this meant. Don't walk in silence and rage. Find out where the soldier is from. Maybe he's from thousands of miles away from home. Maybe he has family someplace else. Maybe he does not want to be there in Galilee either. Find out who he is, where he comes from, what language he speaks, what's his faith, his religion. Talk to him as man to man and see if you cannot find some connections in that. And when you've reached the mile, say to the legionnaire, we're having a good conversation. We're talking to each other, and I've learned a lot about you. I'm going to go further with you because I have to go another mile anyway. I'm walking 2 miles. I'm going beyond where you're going, so let's walk together. So Jesus is saying that you can manage your own life. You can put your own life under different kinds of management, not the management of the outside circumstances that seek to make you a scapegoat and the rest of it, not under Howard Thurman says in this little book, oppressed people easily become victims of the hounds of hell. He means by that of certain emotions that can destroy your life. Anger, rage, hatred, deceit. I think of the 4. And so Thurman insists that if the oppressed go the way of those hounds of hell, then basically they destroy themselves. And if there's a chance for independence or freedom or breaking the shackles of the cruelty or the injustice, they will not have any kind of energy to discover the way out. They will be broken and they will succumb to the evil. So Jesus is offering a way of survival and endurance, and I learned by the time I was in high school, it is a way of resistance. It's a way of struggle. And I'll talk about that before we leave it too far behind. So there's a theology here that Christianity seems to lack. The call here is to become like God in generosity of spirit, in compassion. Not for practical reasons, but so that you can also be a child of God, so you can be like God. This is here where Jesus preaches his sermon on ecology. He says the universe is for everyone. The rain falls on the good and the evil. The sun shines on everyone. The earth is made for everyone. He says that that's all God's grace. That's the Creator's grace. And we all have to share in it and live in it. So do it because that's the way the universe has been made. So it's a rather powerful little statement, but it's one of the great undergirdings of nonviolent theory and practice. So in practical terms, we'll in South Africa, they sought not to in the 80s especially, they sought not to have the same attitude towards the rulers of apartheid as the rulers of apartheid had towards them. And in one of the phenomenal experiences of history in the 20th century, the African National Congress, as they organized the Constitution and the first elections, they wrote into the Constitution that we will be a non-racial society. We will be a democratic society. Now, they're long ways from that, because the vast majority of the people at the time of 1994 lived in poverty. The wealth was at the top in the hands of a minority. Big business prospered, but the ordinary person was largely illiterate. Education was not available. Health care was not available. Housing was a major issue in the townships and in the cities alike. And so South Africa, as a non-racial democratic society, has huge economic and political problems that it has to resolve. But the African National Congress, the major party, has committed itself to that kind of platform, and they're making progress on it. Whether they make progress fast enough, I don't know, but you can't reverse 100 years of oppression in 1994 to 2007. You can't reverse the economic, political patterns in a single decade. But you have to improve year after year. But they're committed not to a neoliberal society, though they're under great, huge pressure from international investment. But they are committed to a democratic society in which health care, shelter, education, the wiping out of illiteracy is part of their plan. All right, any questions or comments in this brief survey of nonviolence up into the first century? How many of you have known this before? Okay. All right. There's one other part of this that I want to lift up, and that is that the followers of Jesus of Nazareth, and I've said to you when I use that term, demythologize your stuff about Jesus and eradicate the dogma stuff and see Jesus as a social activist for the sake of this class. and no doubt a phenomenal man. But the human race has produced a lot of extraordinary men and women. There are lots of them today around the world. We simply don't make that an important part of our study in our talk or academia or politics, but there are many. But the followers of Jesus took literally this passage that we've looked at and other parts of it, and plus the life of Jesus, and proceeded for the first 300 years to be basically a nonviolent church, though they did not call it, again, nonviolence. That is, they would not serve in the army, and very often in the Roman army, the first martyrs were soldiers who were moved to change their religion to that of Jesus, and they were executed for it. So the first martyrs in Christianity were often soldiers. But as a whole, Christians practice a life of peace, nonviolence, love, truth. They practice building communities where there was concord, handling of conflict with measures of goodwill, solving problems in a way that were mutually satisfying to all the different parties. That's what they taught. You see many elements of that in the letters of Paul, in the Christian Bible. So for 3 centuries, the church taught what Jesus taught about the power of love and truth as the way of life and action. Then around the year 323, Constantine, the Roman Empire, discovered Christianity and had himself baptized. And then later commanded that all the soldiers of his legions would be baptized and would be declared as Christians. And so you get then the wedding of the state and the religion, so that they are seen as one. Some historians have called that the fall of Christianity. But in any case, it was a massive movement away from people who took literally the notion of love as the great law of life and sought to understand it and to live it and to practice it, to then a religion that became in many ways the servant of the state and of the status quo. But even as that happened, there were other people in the religion who clung to this radical interpretation. These people very often became the nuns and the monks, went into Orthodox and Catholic orders, into the desert, into mountainous areas where they established places of learning and communities of life. So it was kept alive in that way. And then it also came into being with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, because out of the Reformations there were what's been called the conservative wing and the more radical wing, and the more radical wing were people who took the gospel of Jesus in this radical fashion, as in this Sermon on the Mount, and tried to practice it. They became the Anabaptists, and today they are the Mennonites, later on the Quakers in the 17th century, and then the Amish, the Church of the Brethren, the relatively small denominations in the United States, in Europe, Canada, elsewhere, but they make this creed, and many of them now call it nonviolence. They make the creed of nonviolence a central part of their dogma and their effort to practice. They teach it and they practice it. And so that continues to the same day. So this has not been lost while Christianity has tended to support violence and war on all different sides in the last 500, 600, 900 years or so. So that's an important element in the progress of nonviolent struggle and theory. Any questions or comments on that? Yes, sir?
I'll throw in on the ways that I was often taught to avoid the pretty straightforward demands of Jesus' teachings. I was told that the Sermon on the Mount, and specifically this passage,
Yeah.
was in the Bible to persuade me that I was a sinner and that I needed
Yeah.
Jesus in my heart.
Yeah.
Which feels now like a really, I mean, it's a difficult teaching, so we want to be washed in the blood, but we don't want to follow the teaching. But I found that to be some people's interpretation, a bad interpretation.
Right.
That as if it's just there to convince you of your guilt, and it's not
Right.
a word on how to live.
And Christian ethicists have called it also the impossible ideal. It's there to give you vision and ideals, but it may be useful for personal guidance, but it's not useful in the tumult of public life or community life. Cannot solve problems with it. Reinhold Niebuhr, the ethicists of the 60s and 70s, perhaps the most influential ethicists in relationship to public struggle, called it the impossible possibility, something like that. I have to look that up again, but the impossible possibility. But that is right. It's been largely not taught, largely misappropriated in one way or the other. I have learned, in fact, just recently, that the Church of Christ, the Lipscomb College University, originally that church practiced this radical unconditional love, so that there were people in jail in World War I who practiced it and would not go to the war. They were accused of sedition.
David Lipscomb himself was a conscientious objector.
That's right, exactly. That's largely not the case of the Church of Christ today in the United States. Most would probably be supportive of the Iraq War from the beginning. And many of them would be supportive of capital punishment in one way or another, or punishment of children with violence and the rest of it. So it's a lost art. But in my own denomination, the same thing has happened. In World War II, the studies indicated World War I, World War II, upwards of 80% of United Methodist pastors called themselves conscientious objectors to war and would not serve. They would either go to any number I know of who went to jail in World War II because it wasn't recognized. CO was not recognized as a legitimate classification as it was in the Vietnam War. So I know of pastors who went to jail in World War II. But I would think that in my denomination today, that is not the case of the pastors. I have not seen a recent study, but I submit that from my experience, it's not the case. Anyway, yes, Joe?
No, I don't know if you still have a congregation.
No, I don't.
No, you don't, okay. I was just curious, like, what you told young people in your congregation about going to war, but never mind.
Well, I preached a nonviolent gospel and a nonviolent Jesus in every pulpit I ever had. And in Los Angeles, I had many people who were in the space industry and the defense industry, making lots of money, more money than their parents or grandparents ever thought possible. And I don't remember any argument in church school classes about at least that basic teaching, because they were in defense industry. And I know I never lost any members over it, not in Los Angeles. I may have lost members over some other things, but not that. So I really believe that, I really think the pastor has an obligation to try to preach the truth as he comes to grasp it and hear it, whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable, in the light of the scriptures, in the light of tradition, in the light of history, in the light of his own experience. And to waffle on that is one of the great problems in all religion. Go ahead.
What about like Christian groups and exclusivity, like the whole gay argument, and like women can't be like involved with clergy, etc.
Yeah.
What do you feel about that?
Well, I think all of that's nonsense. She's raising the question about gay, lesbian issues, about women in clergy, in ministry, priests, and so forth and so on. I think all of that is nonsense. I think it is true that in the Bible you have some very harsh sayings about the role of women. I think those have to be discarded and abandoned. I think that at least for the Christian church, Jesus sets a model, because if you read the Gospels, Jesus very clearly had women who were in the inner circle of his disciples and who were in the movement and followed him in Galilee and elsewhere. There were women who watched the crucifixion according to those stories, those narratives, while some of the men were not to be found in that very dangerous moment. So Jesus talked to women publicly by themselves in public, which was a no-no in most parts of the world at that time. So Jesus violated many of the conventional attitudes towards women. In chapter 5 of Mark, he touches a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. That was absolutely unheard of. He would be desecrated by a lot of conventional wisdom. She had been sick for 12 years with hemorrhaging. I have a woman preacher friend who did a brilliant sermon on it. She said she was having her period and the period wouldn't stop. And yet in the midst of a crowd, Jesus talked with her, said she was well, so forth and so on. So Jesus' behavior was one of the misbehaviors of his life so far as conventional experience was concerned. If you look at Moses and Jesus in the Bible, they were very radical thinkers. They both about 1,100 years apart, 1,300 years. The scholars differ on it. But they both say that the central principle of life whether one is religious or non-religious, is that you shall love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. So they lay out a principle that includes other human beings, that you cannot find God apart from your treatment of the neighbor as you treat yourself. You're seeing the neighbor as you see yourself. I don't know of anything that is so bad for the soul of this country than to have the Minutemen running around yelling about illegal, undocumented residents in our country. That's bad theology. There's nothing so bad, I think, as James Dobson and Rod Presley, or Pressler of Ohio, and Pat Robinson of the 700 Club preaching that gay and lesbian people are of the devil and to be ostracized. They are front-rank sinners. There's no rationale from the mainstream teaching of either the Jewish Bible or the Christian Bible. And so I think this is very radical. It means that there are no human beings who, individually or as a group, can be cut out of human conversation and community. I mean, we have the power to do it, which is what we're doing, but we have no right to do it. We exercise our power with racism and sexism and greed and violence, but we're not exercising truth. We're not exercising right. And there's a difference between power and human rights. All right. Well, let me go on then to talk a little bit about how I personally came to use the term nonviolence rather than violence. And this story, this narrative may in part be from my reading of Gandhi. I basically will say that. But I made a change in my own life when I was fairly young. I was in the 4th or 5th grade. This part of this episode is found in The Children by David Halberstam, if you've been reading that. I was a fighter. I had to run the gauntlet of being the preacher's kid and the new kid on the block when we moved to Massillon, Ohio when I was age 4. And my neighborhood colleagues, white and black, before I could be acceptable, I had to fight any number of them, and I did. Then when I started school in the 1st grade, it started over, and school was about 3-4 blocks up Tremont Street, Lauren Andrews, which was a 1 through 9 school, a large school, but 1 through 9. We were all in the same building and the like. So that's where I did my elementary school. And I had to fight my way there because, again, I was both the preacher's kid and I was starting 1st grade. And I did fight my way through. I liked to play anyway. I liked to wrestle and all of that sort of stuff. And I didn't hesitate to hit when I was called a racial slur. I struck out with my fists. Whether the person was a head taller than me or not, or bigger, it didn't matter. Used that kind of insult on me, and I struck out. I still puzzled by why that was so, but in a very real way, I had a sense of my own personhood, and I was confident in myself, and so no one was going to get away with that. And I had at least two sisters who were older who did the same thing. And once my sister, who was a year older, Daisy, and I, in one of the parks in Massillon, were confronted with a white boy who shouted epithets at us, and we both almost simultaneously swung at him. So I didn't mind doing that. Now, my mother always objected to it. My father thought that was normal and natural. So he supported it. And on one occasion, I don't remember if this was first or second grade, I was followed home by a group of guys, all of whom I knew, who were shouting and yelling at me, wanting me to fight somebody that they had selected who they thought could beat me. Because I was a good athlete. Even now, in the apartment I'm living in, I may walk up and down 1,800 steps. I call it a mile for exercise. And I may walk a mile or two. And normal, before my surgery back in June, I walked the campus. I did not. I lived 900 yards away from the campus, so I would walk it and walk where I needed to go and walk home. So I regularly tried to walk at least a mile each time I came to Vanderbilt for any purpose. So that's been a part of my life, since my earliest days. On this occasion, I was refusing to fight for whatever reason, and I don't recall. And I hit my home, which was on Tremont Street, also. And the guys followed me to the sidewalk, moving up to the steps into the front porch. And they were making a lot of racket. I ignored them for the most part and walked on in the house, where my father was coming to the door because he heard the racket coming down the street. And I told him what was going on, and he said, "Jimmy, go out there and fight that boy." So I did. I wasted my lunch hour fighting that boy. So I'm making this a long story just to say that I am not a person of nonviolence because I lack physicality, even now, or because I'm fearful. But what happened was that when my parents bought their first home across town from Tremont Street, and we were at Horseman Elementary School. By we, I meant my sister Daisy and two of my younger brothers. We were all about a grade and a half apart at the most. Again, we could walk to school. It was 3 blocks away through the back alleys and through the schoolyard. And on this bright, beautiful day, I rushed home, and after my mother and I greeted each other, she had an errand for me to run, and she sent me off uptown. I don't remember the errand, but I was the errand boy for my dad and mother. I learned banking and things about checks because I took stuff to the bank all the time on Main Street. And I ran up the street, First Avenue, up to Lincoln Way, made a left turn on Lincoln Way, and parked on my side of the street, the sidewalk being here, was a car just after I turned away from the corner of First Avenue. It was a bright, beautiful day, and the car was wide open, and there was a white child in the car, and as I approached the car, this child stood up on the front seat and stuck his or her shoulders and head out of the wide open window and yelled at me, nigger. So I walked over to the car and I slapped the child. And I ran on up the street and finished my errand for my mother. Ran back down the street, down First Avenue, back into the backyard and home. And my mother was still in the kitchen where I'd left her. She was obviously cooking the evening meal. And after giving her the errand that I had run, whatever it was, I sat down in a favorite chair near the kitchen door that went into the back porch and into the backyard, and then told her of this incident. And without looking around, she was at the stove off here to my left, like this, with her back and shoulder to me. Without looking around, she said, and I shall never forget this, "Jimmy, what good did that do?" And then she talked about our family, our church, God, and who I was and who we were, and that was really very, very strong in our family. And I don't remember the sequence in which she did that, but I do remember the last question, or the last statement she made, and that was, "Jimmy, there must be a better way." So, as this experience dawned on me, and as I experienced it, my whole world changed, and I heard myself saying, though it was not my voice and a voice beyond myself, saying simply, "Never again on the play field, on the street, or when that happens again will I swing my fist. I'm through with that." I heard this voice also saying, "And I will find the better way." So from that time on, in junior high and high school and in the college, I practiced both on the sports field as an athlete and in my personal relationships. I practiced trying to find ways of settling arguments and agreements and anger without imitating it. That was all rooted in Jesus because I was reading the Bible fairly often and the Gospels probably every day by that time. So it was rooted in Jesus primarily and in these teachings. I didn't particularly understand them, but I did discover that a lot of fear and anger vanished from my life before I walked into high school. It was a changing process in me. I was more aware of people and who they were and what was going on in their lives. I didn't have a name for it. I just simply tried to practice it. Then in my freshman year in college, I met the Fellowship of Reconciliation. And I re-met the name Gandhi. And I began to meet and to read essays and periodicals that stressed what was called pacifism in Europe, in Asia, in the United States. And I began reading then the autobiography of Gandhi and Gandhi's essays and the books that were coming out at that time about him. This was 1947, 48, 49, 50. And as I met pacifism, they were wonderful people. Bayard Rustin, A.J. Muste, George Hauser, Jim Farmer, George Brown, Adele and Jean Weaver, who was a chemist at Baldwin Wallace College, my college. I met these people, and they were great people. They became good, strong friends and supporters of mine across the years. But I felt that pacifism didn't answer my activism. So Gandhi fed me, therefore, the term nonviolence and satyagraha and soul force and love force and truth force. And those were all synonymous terms with him. because Gandhi, as Gene Sharp points out, was a very sharp political figure who knew something of the dynamics of power and how to use it and how to exercise it and how to move people and nations with it. So for me, nonviolence is the use of power. And I use that term rather than passive resistance, rather than non-resistance, which is a term out of the Christian movements, and rather than pacifism. And I see nonviolence, as I said in the very first evening, as both a spiritual, moral, political theory about human beings and about how social change comes about, and a lifestyle. I see it as both, and I see that they are united. They are wedded to each other. So the people who call themselves nonviolent, but who do not get out into the community to practice it in direct action and direct struggle with some of the things that go on in city and community and suburbs, are really not nonviolent from my point of view. You have to not only organize it in terms of family, but you have to organize it in terms of your own social environment and political environment. And none of us know how to do that, but we learn to do it by getting out there and sinking or swimming, succeeding and failing. And if, like Gandhi, we make this an experiment, then we discover not only the fallacy of the use of various forms of violence, but you also begin to collect in your own life the imagery of the infinite possibilities of a different way of life, a different way of work, a different way of fighting, a nonviolent way of fighting, and is not only a force more powerful, but it is infinitely superior to the violence going on in Iraq or Sudan or Nicaragua or Burma and lots of other places in the world that are being permeated by the mythology or by the religion or by the faith, which is a false faith, that the way you bring about the improvement of a community or a nation is through violence. There is no more pernicious religion in the world today than that religion that so many people support and sustain. Then the religion that says the only way you can be patriotic to your society is not by battling for justice and truth, but by supporting any armed action that the nation or that the presidents or that the prime minister say support. That's the worst form of religion that the world has today. So we'll pick up again next week as we continue this. I hope you have